In the early 1930s, before the skies turned black with dust, the American Midwest was known as the nation's breadbasket. Wide horizons stretched endlessly, painted with golden waves of wheat swaying under the sun. Farmers woke at dawn, the smell of fresh earth clinging to their boots, believing they were living out the promise of the American dream. It was a life built on faith. Faith in the soil, faith in the rain, faith in the idea that hard work would always bring reward. Families gathered around radios in the evenings, listening to President Hoover's speeches or the crackling voice of a country singer drifting through the static. Children chased one another in the dusty yards after school, their laughter mixing with the sound of screen doors slamming shut and windmills creaking in the breeze. Small towns thrived around grain elevators, general stores, and church steeples. Saturday nights meant a trip into town, the glow of neon signs, a slice of pie at the diner, maybe a new tune on the jukebox. On Sundays, families filled wooden pews, women in modest dresses, men with hats folded in their hands, giving thanks for another week of harvest and survival. Culturally, the Midwest was both traditional and vibrant. Country fairs celebrated livestock and quilts, while fiddlers played songs that carried echoes of Scotch, Irish, and German immigrant roots. Baseball fields on the edge of town brought neighbors together, and local schoolhouses doubled as community halls. There was pride in being self-reliant, pride in owning a piece of land that your children might one day inherit. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The Great Depression had begun to grip the nation. Banks were failing, jobs were scarce, and whispers of hardship crept into daily conversations at feed stores and church picnics. Still, most believed the land would provide. After all, it always had. No one could yet imagine that this same fertile earth, this symbol of abundance, was about to betray them, that the sky itself would turn against them, that the heartland of America, once green and golden, would soon be choked by storms of dust so fierce they would blot out the sun. The stage was set. The Dust Bowl was coming. It began quietly, like a warning whispered on the wind. The rains grew scarce, the fields, once lush with waving wheat, turned brittle under the relentless sun. By 1934, the drought had deepened, and the earth itself seemed to harden into dust. And then the winds came. The first dust storms rolled across the plains like moving mountains. Walls of black grit swallowed farms, roads, and entire towns. People watched in horror as daylight vanished, replaced by a choking darkness. Farmers tied ropes from the barn to the house just to keep from losing their way in the blinding storm. Inside, families stuffed wet rags into window cracks, nailed boards across doors, and hung damp sheets over beds. Yet the dust still crept in, fine, relentless, inescapable. It coated dinner plates, seeped into water glasses, settled on pillows where children slept. Mothers swept floors 3-4 times a day, only to find the house coated again by nightfall. Everyday life turned into survival. At school, children carried damp handkerchiefs to breathe through, their small lungs burning from the grit. Doctors began to speak of dust pneumonia, a cruel illness that claimed the lives of the very young and the very old. Families gathered around radios not for music, but for weather reports, desperate for any sign of rain. And then came the storms with names, like Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. A storm so vast it stretched for hundreds of miles, so thick that it turned noon into midnight. Witnesses remembered the sky turning an eerie red before collapsing into pitch black. Chickens roosted in confusion, streetlights flickered on, and families huddled in basements, praying as the earth itself seemed to be ripped from its roots. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a natural disaster. It was an unrelenting assault on the spirit. Day after day, storm after storm, the people of the Midwest found themselves fighting not just for their land, but for their breath, their health, their very way of life. And still, the storms kept coming. By the mid-1930s, the Dust Bowl had reshaped everyday life into a quiet kind of desperation. Fields lay barren, crops shriveled to nothing, and cattle collapsed in the pastures, their ribs showing through hide. Farmers who once took pride in feeding the nation now stood helpless, watching their livelihoods scatter into the wind. Banks came calling, mortgages couldn't be paid, and one by one, families lost the very land they had carved from prairie sod. Auctions became grim rituals. Neighbors gathered to watch household furniture, tools, and even children's toys sold for pennies on the dollar. Men stood with hats in their hands, ashamed. Women wept silently, clutching babies, as strangers carried away their lives piece by piece. Daily existence was reduced to endurance. Meals shrank to beans, bread, and whatever government rations might arrive. Children, thin and pale, carried lunch pails with little more than a slice of bread inside. Dust invaded every corner of life, settling on supper tables, clinging to bed sheets, and grinding between teeth with each bite. Families told stories of waking in the night, lungs burning, coughing up mud from inhaled grit. Still, there were efforts to hold on to normalcy. Churches remained full on Sundays, hymns sung through raspy voices. On rare evenings, neighbors gathered for a potluck, each dish a small miracle scraped together from ration stamps and gardens. Radios carried the voices of crooners like Bing Crosby, offering fleeting escapes, while Woody Guthrie strummed his guitar, singing of dust storms and wandering souls. But the strain showed. Fathers grew restless, their pride bruised by unemployment and poverty. Mothers carried lines of worry etched deep across their faces. Children who once dreamed of becoming teachers or doctors now learned to be quiet, to go hungry without complaint. In the words of one farmer's wife, it felt like God had forgotten us. For many, the only choice left was to leave. And so, with broken hearts, families loaded everything they owned onto creaking trucks, mattresses tied down with rope, rocking chairs swaying on top, children perched among bundles of pots and quilts. Dust-stained faces peered out from the backs of pickup trucks, staring at an endless ribbon of road that stretched across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and finally California. The license plates told the story: Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, earning the travelers a single name whispered in contempt by locals: Okies. For those who fled, California shimmered like a promised land. Posters promised jobs in the orchards and fields, fruit ripe for the picking, sunshine unbroken by dust. Families dreamed of steady wages, clean air, and the chance to rebuild their lives. But the reality was far harsher. When they arrived, the migrants found labor camps overcrowded and unsanitary. Rows of tents and shacks lined with muddy paths became their new neighborhoods. Men stood in long lines for field work, only to earn pennies a day under a scorching sun. Children picked cotton or fruit instead of going to school. Women cooked meager meals over campfires, stretching beans and bread to feed hungry mouths. Resentment brewed. Local Californians saw the newcomers as cheap labor, competition, and even a burden. Okie was not just a label, but an insult, a reminder that they were outsiders in their own country. Signs in shop windows sometimes read, "No jobs for Okies." Yet in the midst of hardship, a culture of resilience grew. Around campfires, families sang the songs of Woody Guthrie, whose ballads told their story with aching honesty. Songs of wandering, dust, and the search for dignity. Novels like The Grapes of Wrath captured their plight, turning individual suffering into a national conscience. Sports and music offered brief escapes.
On dusty fields, boys tossed worn baseballs, imagining themselves as heroes of the major leagues. Radios crackled with the sound of swing music and gospel, keeping spirits alive when bread was scarce and work uncertain. The journey west was not just a migration of bodies, but of souls, a collective test of faith in the American dream. For many, California was no paradise, but the hope of a future, however fragile, kept them moving forward. And while some found a way to survive, others discovered that the Dust Bowl was not only a storm of nature, but also a storm of human struggle, one that would reshape the nation's identity forever. In the face of despair, when the land seemed determined to drive its people away, Americans discovered a resilience that became part of the nation's soul. Not every family left the Great Plains. Some chose to stay, holding tight to the ground where their ancestors were buried. They patched their roofs against the dust, sealed windows with damp cloth, and planted seeds in soil that looked more like ash than earth. Then came a glimmer of hope. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal began to reach the Dust Bowl. The government created the Soil Conservation Service, teaching farmers new methods, crop rotation, contour plowing, and planting long belts of trees to hold back the gales. These shelter belts, stretching for miles across the plains, were like green walls rising against the storm, living symbols that the land could be saved. But it wasn't just the land that needed healing. People, too, required hope. Federal programs offered jobs building roads, schools, and dams. Families who had lost everything found themselves working again, not as beggars, but as laborers with dignity. Sweat and calloused hands became the price of survival, and in that work, people found a kind of pride. Even in hardship, communities grew stronger. Neighbors shared bread, traded goods, and gathered around small radios at night to hear Roosevelt's warm fireside chats. His voice carried across the static like a friend sitting in the living room, reminding weary Americans that they were not alone. And from the dust itself rose music. Folk singer Woody Guthrie strummed his guitar, writing songs that captured both pain and perseverance. His verses, echoing across the plains, declared, "This land is your land, this land is my land." It was more than a song. It was a promise that no storm could erase the spirit of the people or the belief that America still belonged to everyone who called it home. The Dust Bowl eventually passed, but its memory lingered like a scar across the American heartland. By the early 1940s, rains returned. Shelter belts took root, and farming methods slowly adapted. Yet for those who lived through it, the sound of wind rattling dry earth never fully left their ears. The Dust Bowl was not just a natural disaster, it was a turning point. It showed how fragile the American dream could be when people ignored the balance between nature and industry. Plowing too much, chasing short-term harvests, and relying on luck against the climate had pushed the Great Plains to the brink. Out of that ruin came one of the most important lessons of the 20th century. Prosperity is never permanent, and survival demands respect for both land and community. But the story is not only about tragedy, it is also about endurance. The families who fled west carried their pain, but also their determination. In California, they built new lives, became part of a growing labor force, and contributed to the boom that would fuel America during World War II and beyond. Those who stayed behind turned dust into soil again, proving that even a land broken by storms could be reborn. Culturally, the Dust Bowl etched itself into America's collective memory. The novels of John Steinbeck, the ballads of Woody Guthrie, and the faded black and white photographs of Dorothea Lange remind us of faces covered in dust, children with hollow eyes, and families clinging to hope. They are not just stories of survival, but reminders that America's strength lies not in its wealth or machines, but in its people's ability to rise after being broken. Today, when we look back, the Dust Bowl is more than history. It is a mirror. It reflects both the fragility of human ambition and the unyielding resilience of the American spirit. Out of the dust came a lesson that still speaks to us. Even in the harshest storms, hope can take root, and from ruin, a nation can rebuild. And so, the Dust Bowl became a chapter both painful and profound in America's long story. The storms ended, but their echoes remain in songs, in books, in the memories of families who once watched the sky turn black at noon. It is a story of hardship, yes, but also of resilience. It reminds us that even when the earth itself seems to turn against us, the human spirit can endure, rebuild, and find hope again. As the winds settle and the dust drifts away, we are left with the quiet truth. America has weathered many storms, and in every trial, its people have discovered the strength to stand, to sing, and to carry on. Thank you for drifting with me through this chapter of history. May its lessons linger softly, like the last grains of dust settling in the twilight.